Hop. Alors, on veut pas trop abuser non plus parce qu'on va pas se mentir que on va péter notre crâne. On va la mettre en 1,25 et vous me dites si ça va. Non, mais les couilles, son micro, c'est de la merde. Putain. Ah non, ça va. Donc du coup, le concept de la vidéo, c'est que il fait un classement des cartes qui, selon lui, sont intéressantes à mettre dans un deck / side deck.
Will change upon the deck that you choose to pilot. I'm going to go over all the possible staples and techs that we've seen in past formats and the most commonly used ones, and then see how they stand up to today's format. Against the Fire King decks, against Snake Eye, against Labyrinth, against Rescue Ace, all these sort of decks that, you know, we talked about in the last video. And so let's talk about the 5 categories we have here. We got the best staples. These are the ones you should see in a lot of main decks, assuming you can play it. For example, like Dimension Shifter is probably going to be in that category, but you can't use it.
Dans ce genre de vidéo, je vais juste à la fin. Je pense que c'est... Oh, franchement, les gars, je pense qu'en début de format, c'est intéressant d'écouter ce qu'il a à dire et de zapper les cartes dont on s'en bat les couilles. Mais c'est pas... Je pense qu'aller à la fin, c'est con. Parce qu'en fait, les cartes qui sont fortes ou qui sont pas fortes, tu le sais. Tu t'en doutes que H, elle va aller en haut. Et tu t'en doutes que... Je sais pas, moi, il y a quoi comme vraie carte de merde, là? Tu t'en doutes que Darkhold, ça va aller en bas, tu vois. Mais ce qui est intéressant quand tu regardes ça, c'est d'écouter ce que le mec dit, en fait. Parce que sinon, tu regardes pas sa vidéo. Parce que concrètement, si tu vas à la fin de la tier list, c'est comme si tu regardais la tier list d'un mec qui n'a jamais joué, en fait. Ce qui est intéressant, c'est d'écouter ce qu'il a à dire et d'en débattre si, 1, il se fout de notre gueule, 2, il est à côté, ou 3, il a raison.
Many decks. We got strong options to decks that could be in the main deck, but are also likely to be in side decks. Again, assuming you can play it. Has some merit or cards a little more niche, and we will see popping.
J'ai pas vu qu'il y avait les sous-titres déjà.
Up from time to time, but I wouldn't consider them too common.
Il a le même avis que toi sur H, Imperm, Nibiru et Veiler. Pour le coup, j'ai pas vu la vidéo, donc on va voir.
Subpar choice, which may be very rarely included in decks.
Et les grands esprits se rencontrent de manière générale dans le jeu. Hein.
Real viable option for you to play.
La phrase de Flexer.
And then we have the bad cards which I shouldn't expect to see at all in people's decks, main or side. And yeah, there's plenty of cards to go here. So like last time, this will be a long video. I will try and explain everything as thoroughly as possible. And if you enjoy the type of video, just please let me know. But otherwise.
Ok, à chaque carte, je vais vous dire où je les mets. Call by, je la mets dans 2 ou 3. Je la mets pas en staple déjà.
Let's get going because this will take quite a while. Anyways, let me explain what I'm talking about here. As for Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, this card has been a card that I give a lot of hate towards for quite a while. I generally...
Cette carte, je sais pas ce qu'elle fait, je pense qu'elle est nulle. Il me semble que tu la défausses quand un effet est activé et tu pètes la carte qui active l'effet, mais par contre, t'annules pas.
Have talked about it as a card that I don't think does enough because you're not negating the effect. It often ends up being worse than a negation, and it's just met removal because its activation window is so strict. However, I think right now it has a couple unique advantages. Now, why I like it now, despite the fact that OCG isn't really playing it, is it's fairly flexible in what it can do. You're not really using this as a typical hand trap to break apart their combo or to prevent them from playing. I'm using this almost as a board breaker. So there's the obvious application that if Fire King Island is used without a Fire King Sanctuary in the field, Ogre ruins them. Because this negates the island for all intents and purposes, and then will also trigger the island's mandatory effect to destroy every monster on their field. Doing so is really good. I shouldn't have to say that. There's other cards that do a similar job. Cosmic Cyclone destroys the field as well. However, if they do one of the aggressive plays to...
Ouais, bon, moi, ça va dans avant-dernier ou dernier, ça, je vous le dis.
Snake Eye Asher send off the Sanctuary, they go Flame Merge and do all that stuff, then Ogre hits them like a truck. It's actually insane. However, that's not the main reason here. That's just the random upside that if they play into it, pans out pretty well. The biggest thing I like about it is against cards like IP Masquerena, SP Little Knights, and Appaloosa. All 3 linked monsters are somewhat weak to Ghost Ogre, right? SP, the on-summon effect, is not, but the other effect is, assuming they target itself, usually do. But Masquerena, if you Ogre, will turn that off. And similarly, if they use Appaloosa as a negated card, Ogre will turn that off. And one of the things that I'm looking for in a format is finding something I'm comfortable playing that fits several different roles. For one, I want it to be able to deal with Appaloosa, because if I can't prevent them from making a field, and that's the card they end on, and it's hard to deal with in Engine, it's something that your non-Engine, ideally, either prevent them from getting there, or you have a way to deal with it. I want it to do one of those two things, and Ogre beats Appaloosa. And what it also has to do, though, is I have to make sure that it's playable going first, because if it's not, then it can also work to my detriment.
Pour l'instant, tous les scénarios qu'il a identifiés où Ogre est bien, T'as des cartes qui le font mieux dans la méta. Il a dit que c'était bien contre Fire King Island, Cyclone le fait mieux. Il a dit que c'était bien contre Appaloosa, TTT est meilleur.
Where if they have a lot of non-engine and I have dead cards, I'm unfavored. And then I also want it to be somewhat usable versus cards like Droll and Anaspell. That's a big problem with a lot of these board breaker spell cards. Thrust is the biggest one. So that's what had me thinking of looking to Ghost Ogre. And while this card isn't currently in my UDS deck, or it's after the fact in the time you're seeing this, I do think it is a relatively strong option that I seriously considered for the tournament. And if I had more time, there's a good chance it'd be in there. I think it has several applications, and if you draw this going first, it does have good defensive applications as well. Now, like I said, you want to use it aggressively to beat Appaloosa and stuff, but outside of pairing it with a nib, you can also use it on stuff like Selene, which is insane. On a Charmer, it's fine. They get the search, but they won't get to resolve the Charmer because it has to go to a zone, and then also clear 2 link bodies off the field. Or even if they go Princess and you Ghost Ogre that can be good because the Princess, it'll remove 3 link material from the field. And while that's not brilliant, it definitely does far more than a dead Thrust, for example. Yeah, I would recommend trying this card out. It's something that's been hyped up a little bit since the first weekend regionals. And at the time of filming this, I'm not sure if we've seen it being played in any of the YCS or UDS tournaments. I'm curious to see if it ended up showing up everywhere, but I think this is one of the sleeper picks right now. Next up is Call by the Graves. This seems like a staple in a lot of decks. And the start of the format...
Call by, vous la mettez où? 1, 2, 3, 4 ou 5? Moi, je la mets en 2 ou en 3. Entre le 2 et 3, en vrai, bas du 2.
I was very eager to include it in my strategies. Turning off hand traps is great to force your combos through. Then going second, you can do stuff.
Je pense que c'est strong option la vraie réponse.
Kieran, Ambler Whale, those
strong option, c'est bon.
Theoretically help you break through fields as well. So it's not like solo purpose and going first. However, in most cases, I actually found this wasn't that good. Assuming you're playing a fire deck, you don't want to turn off your Princess, and that's the main card you'd want to be call buying. And then when you're going first, you're often weak to cards like Nibiru or Imperm, and this doesn't check those at all. I actually just didn't like...
Ah, c'est exactement ce qu'il vient de dire. Quand tu joues feu, t'affrontes un deck feu, call by, c'est horrible. Parce que toutes les cartes que tu as envie d'annuler chez ton adversaire, tu veux les jouer en fait.
Call by when I was playing with it, I felt like it was just worse than Crossout, and it really wasn't that good going second. It's one of those cards that again didn't deal with the Appaloosa thing, which I wanted my non-engine to do. And while this card has some merit to it, I ultimately think it is just worse than a lot of other cards. Oh. And despite it seeming like it should be good in a format like this, I just don't think it actually is powerful enough in the situations where it's good. And I think it actually has too many restrictions on when it's usable for it to be fully good.
Il est quasiment d'accord avec moi en fait.
Next up is Mistaken Arrest.
On peut passer, non, c'est en bas ça.
Alright, so this one has been trending downwards for a while, and I think that is going to continue being the case here. But it's nice, again, floodgate-esque effects that are lingering, meaning your opponent can't deal with them after the fact. However, this does come back to bite you on your own turn as well. So after you shut them down for a turn, it will come back to you. And if you got hand trapped and you needed a floodgate to buy a turn for you, this wouldn't be great because now then it comes back to bite you in the ass, unlike something like...
La tier list, elle est basée sur le fait que je fais... Non, il a dit c'est les meilleures cartes dans la méta. Mais il a tourné ça avant de jouer son premier tournoi, avant de faire l'UDS.
Dimension Ground, which will hit them for one turn, and then when it gets back to you, you'll be free to play. I think if you wanted to go for one of those lingering floodgates, different Dimension Ground is just way better, although obviously that can have some ramifications on your end. I think this is just a bad choice that are far better. Even different Dimension Ground isn't fantastic.
Bon, on était tous d'accord là, on est d'accord que c'est 5. Bon, Parfum. Parfum, c'est 2, non? Alors, c'est vraiment une option qui est forte, et en Go First, c'est fort. De là à l'appeler Staple, je pense pas. Donc pour moi, ça serait là, ça serait dans Strong Option, Parfum.
And yeah, other upside
vous en pensez quoi, vous les gars? Jouez le jeu, histoire qu'on puisse débattre.
That you can thrust for it, and I'd probably put it in there because of that. So a different Dimension Ground, if I put on here, I guess I forgot about it, would go here.
Il réfléchit beaucoup du pauvre d'un joueur qui joue Snake Eyes. Mais c'est normal parce que dans la position qu'il a et dans les ambitions qu'il a dans le jeu, il peut pas considérer jouer autre chose que Snake Eyes actuellement. Je pense que vous le voyez, enfin on peut pas jouer autre chose, sauf si on n'a pas les cartes. Après, la version de Snake Eyes, si c'est avec Fire King ou pas, ça je sais pas, mais...
Oh god, I hate this card so much. And so yeah, this card's been popping up a lot in OCG, and in the last few weeks in OCG, we've seen the trend of some decks dropping anti-spell in favor of other counter traps, like Solemn Strike or
Parfum, je le mets dans Strong Option.
Here, right?
Parce qu'en fait, je considère que Parfum est très forte. Mais... En fait, c'est trop bizarre parce qu'elle est très forte dans une situation où tu as une main et donc elle établit un truc en plus à ton board state en go first. Mais en fait, toi, t'as pas de quoi jouer avec ton parfum dans ta main. Elle va pas te faire sortir du. Elle va pas te sortir de la merde en fait. Elle va juste te faire gagner un tour. Donc en ça, c'est quelque chose que seule cette carte-là provide en fait comme service, te faire gagner un tour. Donc c'est pour ça que je la mets dans strong option. Mais best Apple, je pense pas.
The reason for that is similar to the problem with the mistaken arrest. If you get hand trapped a lot, anti-spell with no field is a lot worse. Now, it can still stop your opponent from
C'est
playing
win
and
more.
can buy you time.
Non, c'est pas un win more. Parce qu'un win more, ça veut dire que t'as déjà gagné et tu veux gagner encore plus. Je ne pense pas que ce soit un win more. Il y a un écho. Il y a un écho? Non?
But it's not always the case, and a simple Snake Eye Ash means getting to something like SP Little Knight, and effectively
Attendez. J'ai compris.
denying the anti-spell
Là,
for
il y a
any
plus, c'est bon.
real value. You have to pair it with other cards then for it to be useful, when that's not really what you want when you're looking for a bomb siding card for going first. Although when people, or if people transition to the board breaker strategies, cards like super polymerization, thrust, talents, change of heart, those type of cards, then anti-spell is brilliant. That being said though, if you're in a very hand trap heavy meta and we are focusing entirely on hand traps, it actually just isn't the correct trap choice in my opinion. It's not terrible, but is lackluster. And that's why we've seen Summon Limit, Strike, and Judgment all see some sort of play. This card's by no means bad, but it's not this omnipotent threat that's going to be in every single deck. I think it is a strong option and will be present in many side decks, but it is not the only and by far and away best choice as far as go first side card is. Next up is Ash Blossom.
Bon, Ash Blossom. Là, on est d'accord qu'il n'y a plus d'écho, les gars. C'est bon, là. Hein. Oh. Je crois que la rediff va y avoir de la musique dessus. En gros, hier, j'ai eu la mage Windows et du coup, ça a fait de la merde et ça a déréglé tout mon OBS. Et du coup, il va falloir que je règle ma piste 6, je pense. Parce que du coup... Routing. Yep. Bon, c'est pas grave.
All Faithful, yeah. So we're rarely going to see this card be a completely terrible choice in a format. I do think it's also rare to see it be one of the best staples. I actually think there are other hand traps that are better than this card, and don't actually love it. But I think you are forced to play a very heavy hand trap meta. In that, this is up there. It's probably the hand trap I play fourth. But if you're playing a deck, you want to have 12 hand traps or upwards of that, then Ash Blossom is where you want to be. My biggest problem with Ash is it by itself doesn't really do enough versus a lot of these decks. Ashing Snake Eye Ash isn't fantastic because its on-field effect still exists, and that can be a problem even if they don't have.
Ouais, la position de Ash dans la méta, je suis d'accord qu'elle est pareille. Je trouve qu'il exagère un peu sur quand il dit que c'est la 4ème qui jouerait. Mais je comprends ce qu'il veut dire. Comme dit la Ash actuellement, elle est censée negate genre original, tu vois. Elle est pas censée se faire sur, comme ils le disent, sur un friend parce que bah t'annules pas l'effet, t'annules le cul de partie et du coup bah les cartes maintenant elles ont 28 effets donc.
On fire, so they can do other stuff to start playing a little more than you'd like. And then obviously there's also Hida.
En mirror, c'est la pire des 4. Ça dépend. Si Droll est dans les 4, c'est pas la pire des 4. Genre si tu joues contre Snake Eyes pur, Ash est forcément meilleur que Droll.
If your opponent Hidas your Ash, then it gives them +1 link material to bridge into Princess, which in a lot of cases can be hard when you're getting hand trapped. So that ability to go into Princess and really ramp up your follow-up and your disruption is dangerous. So when Ash is your only hand trap, it's not super comfortable.
Alors pour moi, le seul vrai problème que j'aurais à reprocher à Ash, c'est qu'elle est feu, quoi.
It is still good because if you Ash like a Sinful Spoils, then you can often deny a Fire King deck of access to the Fire King cards. They'll be locked in a Snake Eye engine, which, while powerful, is not the end of the world. You can beat through that with engine, or if you have other hand traps, it's a lot easier to deal with. They also have less resiliency and follow up without the Fire King cards. No, again, it's not zero. That deck is still good. It's pretty much just playing pure Snake Eye at that point, but Ash does help you to some degree there. So yeah, it should be in pretty much everyone's deck. You'd have to be playing no hand traps for that to be the case, and there's merit to that. And I strongly debated putting it as a strong option, but ultimately, if I think that 80% of decks need to have 12 plus hand traps, and this will be one of those 12 hand traps, even if it's at the end of the best staples, it is one of the best staples. As for Dimensional Barrier, we are in a very link-heavy format, and I think a lot of extra decks have 15 links or 14 links and almost nothing else. And as a result, Barrier is just not very good. The extra deck decks may include Tier Elements, but Barrier's never been brilliant for stat deck. It's been okay.
C'est quoi ça? Vous allez m'insulter là. C'est Dimensional Barrière ça? Non. C'est Dim Barrière? Ouais, non, c'est dans. Tu la joues pas ça.
If you want other floodgates, again, stuff like Different Dimension Ground is just better. But yeah, I think you can very easily put this in a bad spot. I'd say this is the worst one we've had to deal with yet. Which is surprising because if you go back 6 months, this card was an absolute menace.
Là, actuellement, les decks jouent trop le bien. Ensuite, c'est quoi? The Black Goat. The Black Goat, ça se joue dans Labyrinthe en vrai. Ça se joue dans Labyrinthe. Donc je pense que ça se met pas en bad parce qu'en Labyrinthe, ça existe, non? Ça va là. 4 ou 5 pour The Black Goat.
But that's how metas evolve. So it's interesting to look back on how things have changed so drastically, so quickly. We got a new one now, and that is the Black Goat Laughs.
Hier, je l'ai pris sur Poplar, ça m'a fait tout drôle.
It lets you declare a card name, and then your opponent cannot, or neither player can summon monsters with that card's name for the rest of the turn, except from the grave. But it also has a graveyard effect, and you can banish it to declare a card name, or monster name, and then neither player can activate the monster's effects in the field this turn. It has some interesting uses, and it's very unique in its properties, almost Prohibition-esque. Now, the on-field effect is actually lacking in many cases.
T'as pris sur Poplar ça, là, Black Goat. En gros, j'ai invoqué Fren. À l'invocation de Fren, il a banni Black Goat du cimetière, il a déclaré Poplar. Et...
Because letting your opponent still be able to summon from the grave means, in especially a fire-based format, stuff like Promethean Princess, like discarding with Phoenix, then Princess Revive, pretty much turns off all of its uses. However, its graveyard effect can be pretty good. Now, there's too many threats in the Fire King deck for it to be actually good versus Fire King. However, something like Rescue Ace, hitting Turbulence can be quite good. That being said, you have to get into the grave. So how easy is that? And that's going to rely a little more on synergies and it becomes less of a staple at that point. If we're talking about it within the context of Labyrinth, it's a pretty cool card. It's solid. And it's similar to a Shuffler where it's good value to discard other furnitures, but it's also some playability when you draw it. That being said, I think it is not the best position right now. It's a subpar choice, and I really would include this in many cases. I have seen some people use this as a thrust target because if you...
Ouais, logique, hein. C'est logique qu'ils le mettent là. Ensuite, c'est Psy Delta. Psy Delta, j'imagine qu'il va le mettre là. Moi, je le mettrais dans Mérite. Pas forcément très fan. Mais bon. On va voir ce qu'il en dit. Moi, je la mettrais en As some Mérite, là, Delta.
You can send it off of a Witch or... It's just Witch. You send it for Witch, and then you can use it as a bit of a board breaker, almost calling something like Appaloosa or Garunix or IEP to help push through a little bit. And while it may not do an awful lot, it will do something. And then when this specifically can come up even more is if you thrust but you got drolled. So if you got drolled and you have a thrust now, whereas it wouldn't have done anything before, if you have a Witch plus a thrust in your hand, you can thrust for the Black Goat Laughs, send it off, and it's something. Is it enough to win the game? Probably not, to be honest, if you're playing through a field, and that's why I still don't think it's worth playing that type of engine, but it is something that exists. Next up is Psyframe Delta. So this is another one of the hand traps that is very strong right now. Hand traps are very well positioned, and it's seen quite a bit of play in OCG. And it does very similar things to Ash Blossom, where you can hit the Sinful Spoils to deny Fire King access. We can also hit stuff like Crossout, which can be very good at critical points. Talents, when they go first, is pretty nasty. And then sometimes hitting the Fire King Island or Sanctuary can be pretty good too. It's a valuable hand trap. And when you play that, it also lets you play Gamma, which is broken, whereas before you wouldn't want to play Gamma with just the driver. So it actually has a lot of merits. Obviously, you don't want to main deck it because going first, this card is terrible. And you get into a grind game where you're trading hand traps, this does 0, and it's really not a card you want to draw. I would expect to see this in 0 main decks unless someone's blinding second. And in that case, I do expect to see it in a lot of side decks though. I know that I'm playing it at my UDS, and we'll see how that went, but I do like it to bring my hand trap account up to a point where I'm approaching 80% chance of seeing multiple hand traps when I go second, and this is nice to pair. And now the upside that it has compared to Ash is that it plays around Hita. They can't Hita it. Now the downside is if they play Thrust post side going first, which albeit rare can happen, it gives them a thrust target to get talents or any stender they want. That can be pretty nasty. However, I'm expecting not.
On pense quoi de ça? Moi, j'avoue que je suis pas fan. Mais faut admettre que la carte fait du sens. Faut admettre que j'avoue que dans la position du entre guillemets du contre ATTT, c'est intéressant. Il y a 2 hand trap, mais je suis pas pour le moment, je suis pas convaincu.
Not as many thrusts. I don't think the card is that great because of Anispell, because of draw. And then if someone's playing thrust, if they aren't playing a card like a trap, like Daruma Cannon or Different Dimension Ground or Black Oat Laughs to set off of thrust, it's not going to be in their deck post side. It's really not powerful enough as a sort of countermeasure to hand traps. And while they could possibly be playing these other traps, it's another spot of the side deck. It's another deck building concession. So yeah, obviously it's not without risks. Any side from card has its risks, but I think the payoff is rather nice. Now, one other thing that can happen, which can be interesting, is putting cards on the field on the first turn opens your opponent up to doing Zelantis Princess stuff like immediately on their first turn, which it really isn't that like meaningful. It doesn't matter that much, but there's something funny that can happen that could matter. I don't know. Next up is Ghost Spell. It's a card that we've seen in a lot of side decks.
Bon, Ghost Bell, c'est strong option. C'est potentiellement en miroir, ça peut surprendre si le mec il chain block pas son flamberge. Contre la brinde, c'est vraiment bien. Ghost Bell, c'est strong option, j'espère.
For a while now, but I don't think it's that good. I think I'm going to put it in the has some merit section, and the reason is I think this card does not do enough versus the fire decks. Hitting something like a Garunix or Kirin or Princess Revive, it's just not that good on the first turn. Hitting even a Flamebridge if you can, sometimes it's chain blocked. It really doesn't function hard enough as a hand trap. I think oftentimes you're better off using it to bell Princess Revive effect, at which point I'd rather Crow. And even then, that's also just still not a very strong board breaker. If I'm playing it as a board breaker, I have to understand that's what I'm using it for. And then in the context of a board breaker, it's just not good. So I would never really have this card in my side deck for Fire King. At which point would I main it? No. Why would I play this card then? If you side deck it, it should be for the express purpose of Labyrinth. And we saw that before when Labyrinth was a lot more popular and it was a way stronger of a deck. That's a big reason why Bell was in side decks. However, if you check out my last video, my last meta tier list about the decks of the meta, I think Labyrinth is rather lowly rated. And unless your deck has a hard time with Labyrinth or you really want to prepare for it heavily, I wouldn't put too much into it. And then even when it comes to this card versus other decks like Voiceless Voice, it is usable, but...
On pense quoi là de son avis? Du coup, il estime que Ghost Bell est intéressante, mais ne fait pas assez. Parce que aujourd'hui le format, ça part en couille de tous les côtés. Mais il la compare vraiment que contre Feu, quoi. Il en parle pas contre Labyrinthe. Vous en pensez quoi, vous? Moi, j'avoue que je trouve que la carte est quand même très polyvalente. Je pense que c'est vraiment une bonne carte de side, de manière générale.
But it's not fantastic. It can get them off guard pretty nicely if they play with the Dynamondo line, but that's not a given. And if you like Bell the effective low to come back when it's ritual summoned, they are extenders to keep playing. Like if they have the trap, like if they open the spell, they would just get the trap off the first low, and then that can just get a second low to mitigate your Bell, at which point you're trading down a card. You're trading 1-for-1 in a way that's not meaningful. That's exactly what that deck wants you to do. Yeah. Not happy with Bell in any of these scenarios. It's really just Labyrinth. And once you understand that, and you also realize that Labyrinth isn't even that good or that popular right now, I would stay away from Bell. Now, obviously, as I'm filming this, there's the events that are about to happen. I'm curious if I'm proved wrong, if this card is going to be very popular, or if Lab is going to be that popular, but I really don't see Lab as being...
Aux États-Unis, la brinde, c'est pas populaire? Genre, c'est vraiment genre un deck qu'ils aiment pas? Ok. Après, c'est Graal interdit. Bon, Graal interdit, c'est 4 ou 5? C'est 4, non? Genre, je le mettrais dans Support Choice.
This huge meta threat at the moment. Next up is Forbidden Chalice. Okay, notice how I've been talking about this is a very handship heavy format. I don't like a lot of board breakers right now, and I think a large part of it is the presence of Anti-Spell and Joel Lockbird. Chalice was going to have similar problems. It's a little better versus Anti-Spell because you can chain it, but sometimes you can't hit stuff like the IP because that'll still be in spell trap card zone until after everything's resolved. Yeah, I don't know. Like, it's also just not very powerful. The thing is, like, if your opponent goes full combo and you have a Chalice, trading 1-for-1 is fine, but it's not great. I'd like it to be doing something else, and it doesn't have the high roll potential that Ghost Ogre does to just end them if they aren't playing around it properly. And at the same time, I also think it's worse as a disruption when you go first. So I think this card is just subpar. I'm not huge on it. Yeah, I don't know much to say. It's just, I think Effect Negation.
Ok les gars, Dark Roller. Dark Roller, je le mets dans subpar. Je pense que ça ne sert à rien.
Is fine. It's pretty good right now as a hand trap, but not as a breaker. As for Dark Ruler no more, you get to turn off their entire field, but you don't deal damage in that turn. And that's a big problem because it's pretty easy for these fire decks to play for follow-up. So if you're Dark Ruling them, it's almost the same thing as SPing them, and oftentimes we want to avoid doing that because you want to kill them. It's a lot easier to kill them than it is to shut them off of follow-up with disruptions. Or if it's enter a grind game. If you're very comfortable entering a grind game and your deck is built to do, maybe Dark Ruler can be more impactful. Or if your deck has great ways of shutting out the opponent after you've turned off their negates, Dark Ruler has more merit. Now, obviously, if you're doing this, you have to play through the Princess still. One thing I don't like is if they have an Arvada up, even though you Dark Ruler negate it, when they Princess pop the Arvada, the Garunix will come back, they'll pop a card with the Kirin, and then Arvada comes back again. But you're really not dealing with the Arvada if that's what they're entering on. However, if it's like Flameburge, Apo, or something like that, then you are dealing with both those threats. I think this card is just a subpar choice. Again, I'm not a huge fan of the break.
Non, en vrai, je suis chaud, je suis un joueur. Hein. Bon, Cyclone, s'il le met autre chose que dans Strong Option, je suis énervé. Sauf s'il le met dans Staple en vrai. Ça pourrait m'étonner, mais je pense qu'il va le mettre dans Strong Option.
And it has the same weakness
Moi, je le mettrais dans Strong Option.
Next up is Cosmic Cyclone. Cosmic has been an extremely popular card in a lot of decks recently, and there's a good reason why. So post side, it's great to pair with other stuff. If your opponent's feels any bit weaker, this card will put them in the ground, or if their field is strong and you have this plus talent or breaker, it can be fantastic. And now what are you doing? Why am I saying that? Because it's hitting Fire King Island, nukes the field, so it punishes an Appaloosa line a lot. It really will force people towards playing stuff like Ambler Whale, or just effects that aren't as overwhelming to your as disruptions. And that's obviously positive, but even when they don't do that, Cosmic can still hit stuff like Anti-Spell. It can still hit sets like Imperm. It can still hit the card that they put with Flamebridge, so if they have an IP there. So it's very versatile in that way. As a going first card, people have talked about how it could be playable, but it really, Cosmicking like a Poplar or a Sanctuary, while it has some usage, really isn't good enough for it to warrant play. If your opponent's getting that far enough, you want more impactful disruption. I think that's why we're going to see it not be in main decks.
Un des vrais arguments qui fait que Cosmic aujourd'hui est quasi obligatoire, c'est l'omniprésence, notamment en France, d'anti-spell. Alors j'ai l'impression qu'un mec qui commence en France, il a toujours anti-spell. Hein. Je sais pas si vous êtes d'accord avec ça, mais...
One of my favorite things to pair Cosmic with, though, is Cosmic and Talents, because you Cosmic the island, you force them to trigger all their effects, then Talents can tear them apart. If you feel like you can beat the board, you go after their hand, clear out the hand trap, and then it should be pretty good. Now, one new counterplay we are seeing is people using Relinquished Anima and Nightmare Unicorns to do a play where you shuffle back your Fire King Island, get the draw off Unicorn, and because cards don't trigger from the deck, the island won't nuke the field, at which point Cosmic Cyclone becomes a lot worse. That being said, there's still the other targets for it that still exist, so unless they choose not to end on Flamebird, and they don't have any back row, the Cosmic will still have usage. It's not like it's completely futile, and it's not completely dead. So yeah, very strong option for now. That being said, I think it'd be very extreme to play around just Cosmic Cyclone, and that's not what we're going to see happen.
Bon, Droll, j'espère qu'il le met en Strong Option. Moi, je pense que c'est Strong Option, mais à voir.
Next up is Droll and Lockbird.
Alors c'est là que je le mettrais,
so
moi.
I said before how there were the 12 hand traps I wanted to include in most decks. The next best one, I think, is Droll and Lockbird. Droll is weird. I think it's one of the worst ones to pair, which is not normal. Usually Droll paired is insane. But I think when you pair Droll now, it's not always the best, because if you have Veiler Imperm plus Droll, you either, if you're letting the Ash resolve, Snake Eye Ash, and then you're drawing them there, then the Veiler Imperm does a lot less. If you're Veiling or Imperming the Ash, then the Droll's not being used, right? It is inefficient. And it is weird for Droll in that spot. However, Droll can be the one to solo hands by itself as well. I guess a lot of the hand traps can. And when you go first, Droll is nuts. It can be used as a hand trap, and it can definitely help lighten boards up. And then when you go first, it is insane, I think, because it makes it way hard for them to kill you. And
c'est exactement ce que je pense aussi. Je pense que Droll, quand t'es premier, elle est exceptionnelle, parce que du coup, ton adversaire, il doit passer ton board tout en étant sous Droll. Et donc, du coup, c'est trop chiant, en fait. Là où Droll te fait rien quand t'es... potentiellement fait rien à l'adversaire quand t'es en second, c'est juste un -1. Quand t'es en first, elle met les papiers sur la table. Elle dit à ton adversaire, écoute, non seulement tu dois passer mon board, potentiellement même me tuer, mais ça va être sans tuto, mon pote. Et comme je disais tout à l'heure, vu que Fire King, il te permet d'avoir plus de ressources que ton adversaire grâce à son premier tour, grâce aux effets d'Island, grâce aux effets de potentiellement un Hit Soul qui est dans la line et tout, bah, sans tuto, c'est plus dur à remonter déjà.
Even if they don't kill you, but they just make a small field, you can usually play back to that relatively easily. And then another thing it does is similar to Ashe, is while it's not great at like pairing or doing everything, it does shut off the Fire King cards pretty well. Again, if you draw them when they had Poplar, then they don't get to Ponix or whatever. Or even if they open Ponix, they can't resolve Island. It is a great way of stopping that from resolving. I think sometimes versus Fire King, draw can be better than Ashe, but in simplified game states, Ashe is better, and versus the broad meta, Ashe is better as well. Versus the pure SNEC deck, draw is just not good. I expect to be draw in many decks. It's probably one of the best strong options, but there are reasons not to play this card. I would put it there comfortably. Next up is Contact C, and similar to Barrier, we are
Je sais pas ce que c'est ça. C'est quoi cette carte, les gars?
a link format. Everything is generic. Princess is generic. This card is just bad. Yeah, not good at all.
Bon, moi, ça pose le débat tout de suite. Book of Eclipse, on la met où? On la met dans 4 ou dans 5? J'ai la sensation que c'est plutôt 5. Quoique, peut-être 4 en vrai. J'ai l'impression que ça ne sert vraiment à rien.
Not gonna waste time explaining that one. Next up is Book of Eclipse. All right, so with link formats, it's a bit weird with book monsters. Sorry, with book cards, because you can't wait to hit cards later. Like, you can't wait for a Pearly Exceed. You can't wait for the Unchained Exceed. You can't wait for the Cash Exceeds to really get value. And booking straight away doesn't always turn off their plays. They can extend from the hand, not guaranteed, but relatively often. And the other issue with book cards is they don't always actually cut off a resource. What I'm saying is, if you book a Snake Eye Poplar, you may think, okay, it's gone for the rest of the turn. Cards like Island or Diabellstar can still clear it off the field in Engine, and then put it back in the grave to keep using. It's not actually that simple. If you could say Book of Flameburge and then never have to deal with the effect resolving, that would have a lot more merit, but it's just not what happens. And then as a board breaker versus stuff like Appaloosa versus IP, it's not very good. You can, I guess versus IP, it's okay. You can maybe catch your opponent off guard if they go IP effects and you book all their monsters and the force link IP plus Appaloosa, and that could be neat. And it can turn off Princess as well sometimes. So versus the breaker, it's like not the worst, but it's not the best either. And versus Nana Spell, obviously it's chainable, but again, if you can't like make him get max value out of it, it can kind of be funky. And then with board breakers as well,
détaille trop, frérot, mets-le en bas là.
And they're very mixed in what they do.
Yeah.
It's rough, right? Your opponent doesn't end on a fire link monster or a way to end a fire link monster or a Kieran in the hand. Eclipse could be good because you could turn off a lot of their interruptions, no Princess anymore, which also means no Garunix line. And yeah, it's the same way how resolving as Atlantis to put all the monsters face down could be good. But if they end on like an Amblo Whale, then Eclipse looks silly because Princess and all that stuff is still going to be a threat. But yeah, this card is subpar choice. I think you're making a big gamble on a board breaker that's probably not even worth it. Although you get to use it going first, which is nice.
Changement de cœur. Changement de cœur, je sais pas trop quoi en penser. Je pense que c'est vraiment pas bon. Mais ça reste une carte qui potentiellement dans certains match-up peut être intéressant. Moi je la mettrais dans Subpart Choice ou alors dans As Some Merit, donc 3 ou 4. Je pense que je la mettrais dans... peut-être dans 3 parce que du coup c'est quand même une carte qui fait quelque chose qui est assez unique. Et donc à partir de là, si tu veux rechercher cet effet dans le jeu, tu la mets en 3 quoi. Mais bon. Je veux pas moi.
Next up is Change of Heart. This is a board breaker that I've toyed around with for a little bit, and why I think it could be good is if you're playing a very heavy board breaker deck, in conjunction with Thrust or Talents, it will force your opponent to do something. And if your opponent's ending on Appaloosa, this card is nasty, right? Just Change of Heart, steal Appaloosa is insane. For the fact that it's a negate, and then even if it's impermed later, turning that Appaloosa into his Atlantis pressures even more, right? If your opponent hasn't used Princess yet, and they have no links that aren't, or no fire link monsters, then Atlantis can turn their fires face down, and then you can go from there. So it forces Princess out, and pretty good. But Anna-Spell exists. So does Draw, right?
Ouais, c'est ça le problème. C'est anti-spell, encore une fois. Une magie normale, t'en veux pas, hein. Ouais, je suis d'accord avec ça. Moi, j'avoue que j'en veux pas de cette carte. J'en veux pas de cette carte. Fenrir. Fenrir en 3 ou en 4? Je m'étonnerais qu'ils le mettent en strong option actuellement. 3 ou 4. Moi, je le mettrais soit très bas du 3, soit haut du 4, genre. Fenrir en engine tout seul, bon. What's up?
Draw matters because if you're trying to thrust for cards, right? If I'm trying to combo this with Change of Heart plus thrust, I go Change of Heart like a Amblo Whale, and they chain Kieran, then if the goal is to thrust and then getting drolled afterwards, like it hurts me a lot. Like now I can't ash, can't bonfire, and it's just nasty. Now there are workarounds. We've seen a lot of people play stuff like engage to draw with thrust. It's another package that if you went for that, which is a lot powerful, and those are the type of decks you'd see these heavy spells in. I think those normal spell type strategies are going to be pushed aside because they unfortunately just can't risk these two cards existing. And yeah, there could be an event where it's just a very good meta call for these spells because people aren't prepared for them anymore. And that could absolutely happen. I would not be surprised, but at least for the current moment when it's a little more undefined, you don't know what your opponent's ending on either, and there's still drolls and ana spells everywhere. I'm not including this likely in my deck, but it has merit. It has some merit. Next up is Cashier Fenrir, and I've been a very big critic of this card. I think this card as a non-engine card is lackluster. I think going first, it is mediocre disruption, and if your deck is already weak to Nibiru, then you're playing into Nibiru even more, because if you get Nibiru,
il est trop énervé sur Fenrir.
Accomplishing nothing out of it. And as for going second, this just gets obliterated by Princess or SP. It really isn't like super high functioning. Adding the card to hand off Fenrir, like if that resolves, isn't very good. Also plays into Droll. There's just no reason to play this card. I think this card is just bad. It may even be subpar, but I think this card is just bad.
Wow, non, c'est de la haine ça. Bon, il faudra au moins la mettre en subpart choice, il abuse.
I think it shouldn't really be in anybody's deck unless you are a Cashier player. If you have that as an engine, then fantastic, but it should not be your non-engine cards. There are just way better options. Next up is DD Crow. This card is relatively popular, but I think
Alors moi, DD Crow, je le mets dans subpart choice. Je pense que c'est moins bien que les Beasted.
this card is just not very good. It has some merit, but I'm going to put it in subpart choice to really get across to you guys. I think this card is heavily overrated. As far as disruption goes, it really doesn't do a lot. Sometimes you can crow them to stop a flame bridge from resolving because they only have 2 fires engraved, but that's not what's going to happen. Crowing the Fire King target can keep them off of 1 body. But the thing is, your hand trap is not stopping them from playing, it's keeping them off of 1 body, which will rarely.
Prosout, tu la mets où? Prosout, elle va dans Strong Option, obligatoirement. Parce qu'il y a trop de deck feu, donc c'est forcément une carte qui va être omniprésente dans ce mini-format jusqu'à sortir de la prochaine extension. Prosout, elle est obligée d'aller dans Strong Option, je pense.
Shut them down. They may have a
Ça m'étonnerait même pas qu'il la mette en staple, mais je pense que c'est Strong Option la vraie réponse.
Aggressively to crow Princess or Garunix as a board breaker, but again, it's trading meh. Maybe better than call by, but it's worse going first, and it's not functioning as a hand trap either.
Retournement de veste, non, j'aime pas Crossout, mais je pense que c'est une Strong Option. C'est juste que je l'aime pas. Mais c'est pas parce que je l'aime pas que je peux pas reconnaître que la carte est efficace.
Really, it's the same thing of like versus tier. It's not like it seems like it should be fine, but it doesn't do enough for it to actually be good, or for me to actually want to play it. And I think this card just shouldn't be in your decks for those reasons. Yeah, I don't really have much positive to say about Crow. The one thing that I do like about it is if you're playing a pure Snake Eye deck and you want to include Wear of Thous as a way of giving yourself more engine, more ways to play through stuff like Imperm, or more ways to play through stuff like Valor. What Crow can do is it means when you go second, you can play 1 of Crow in your deck, and now if you have Wear of Thou and you don't need more engine, you can Wear of Thou for DD Crow, deal with the
J'espère qu'il y a Spooky dans le truc, je la vois pas là depuis tout à l'heure.
Princess, and that could be pretty good.
Je peux vraiment entendre parler de Spooky parce que je pense vraiment que c'est une des 2 meilleures cartes du format.
Where it's like a 1-of thing you grab, same way as you'd have the dual different dimension ground for thrust. Very similar, but to probably even less frequent extent. Next up, we got Crossout Designator, which has been a staple in OCG for pretty much every deck because of Maxi, but I think it is, outside of that, also very good here. And if we're going to a
Nailed it.
very heavy hand trap meta, and they're expecting post side to see a lot of hand traps, Crossout's a great way of pushing through your hand traps. Specifically, if our deck is weak to Impermanent Beard, which I think are great hand traps right now, having the way to stop those hand traps is fantastic. Crossout does that, right? Like, we're able to stop those where other hand traps, we're also in an almost, or really we are, in a tier 0 meta, being able to hit like a Poplar or a Snake Eye Ash or a Fire King Island. I don't know how much I do that. Crossout acts almost like a Solemn Judgment, although not for summons. It could be very good. So I think Crossout is one of the absolute best cards aside going first. That being said, it obviously has the issue where it's not actually that good going second. If you hit like Garunix or a Kieran to stop that from resolving, or Nervada, it's meh. It also shuts you off using the rest of the turn, or you have to banish it from your deck, right? Which isn't always fantastic. So I wouldn't be like too keen on throwing this in as a side deck option for going second, but I do think it's great going first. That's weird. This wasn't my main deck for the UDS tournament. I don't think it is as good as the 12 hand traps I feel are more mandatory. And if you're not playing a fire deck, then I think Crossout just isn't that good either. Next up, we got Harpy's Feather Duster. Okay.
Duster, il va la mettre dans quoi? Dans Mérite?
Okay, so versus the fire decks, no one
C'est pas une carte qui est très populaire
They
actuellement.
have Sanctuary Duster is not very good. The Flamebirch can chain to bring out the IP or Arvada, whatever's in Spell Trap card zone. Versus the fire decks, this really doesn't accomplish much, right? So we'd have to be playing for something else. Versus Labyrinth, I actually think this card's not that good. I'd rather have Cosmic, rather have Bell. If I want cards for Labyrinth, there are better options than this, right? People aren't playing the Floodgate version as much. So you'd want this for some sort of other Floodgate deck, right? So if we're seeing Cash or Flunder show up in the meta as this anti-meta deck with D-Fisher, maybe you want Duster, or even Summon Limits on the Voices Voice deck. And it's okay in those matchups. And then the other time you'd want it is just Rescue Ace to clear all the back row. But there are other perfectly fine options that I think have a bit more merit to them. And I don't know. This card, yeah, it's not terrible. It has some merit, right? But I think there is a very strong case for it not being in your side deck.
Dark Hole, bad.
Right? Unless you really need to allocate spots to Rescue Ace or these Labyrinth decks, it just really isn't too important. Now, obviously, you should be building your deck for fire matchups.
Bad.
So your side deck should have a lot of space for these other matchups. And when that's the case, then Duster can make its appearance. But for me, at least, Duster is not in my deck at the moment. Next up is Dark Hole. As far as breakers go, this is weird, right? Because if you're Cosmicing Fire King and that's acting as nuking their field, Dark Hole just seems worse because it's the same thing without the utility of hitting like the Flamebird back row or an anti-spell. Yeah, no, this card just isn't great. It's like not. No, it's just bad. I'm sorry. I don't know what I have to say that's good about this. It's pretty bad. It's
C'est quoi ça?
not like level of bad as maybe these two cards, but it's not good either. It's not even a subpart choice. Like I'd say all 5 of these are better than Dark Hole. Next up is
Fantasmé. Oh! En vrai, Fantasmé, je pense que je le mets dans le haut du 3. Je pense qu'elle est vraiment pas nulle à certains timings. Ah, c'est peut-être même potentiellement strong. Hein. 3, je pense. Some merit.
Phantasme. It's a card that honestly I haven't given enough light. I haven't given it a chance enough to see how good it is. I know some people have liked it. My biggest problem with it though is it's not directly a hand trap itself, so it's not going to be usable. So it's not going to be the card that stops them from playing. Typically, I like this card more with board breakers, which if I'm trending away from, I'm not a huge fan of. However, in a board breaker deck, it's great. The other problem though is it's weaker to Talons and Thrust. One of the advantages of playing a board breaker deck is not having the weakness to those cards. Not a fan of that. And in hand trap decks, if you're drawing into hand traps with them, one, you're turning off Imperm, and if you're playing post side, Delta / Gamma. And then also, you can't use the hand traps in the most opportunity spots, right? Because if they've gone into a Link monster, they've gone through quite a bit of other plays, right? Droll would do a lot less as well. Veiler would be a lot less impactful. The only one that really maintains the same level of impactfulness would be like Inabiru. Unless that's the only card you ever want to see and you really need to dig for it. I wouldn't love Phantasme too much, but I do know many people who like it. And if you can use it as a breaker almost, some places where it is cool, where if it's your turn and your opponent uses Flamers to summon IP, assuming you can either stop an Apo or they don't have it, Phantasme there can be really good because then it'll let you draw 3 cards and cycle back 2 to really fix your hand. And then it still has the prevention of targeting, so you can prevent like a princess from coming down. In those spots, it's fantastic. However, without a uniform and
Globalement, Fantasmé, je pense que c'est une carte qui est super intéressante, mais avec que 15 cartes en side, c'est super compliqué de la placer. Il faut vraiment que tu aies des trucs à côté qui remplissent des objectifs que tu te fixes avec ton side. Et c'est pour ça que c'est une carte que j'envisagerais pas pour le moment.
Field, it's not great. And again, that is also weak to draw on Lockbird, right? If you get drolled before that point, then Phantasma is going to sit in your hand dead, and I'm not happy with that as a result either. I guess if you're committed to that as a board breaker strategy, then maybe, but that's my biggest apprehension with playing Phantasme. Lava Golem.
Lava Golem, c'est là ou là, non? C'est 4 ou 5? Je dirais 4, parce que 5, c'est un peu dur pour une carte comme ça.
Imagine clearing your opponent's field and then giving them a fire for Princess. I can tell you guys pretty confidently. Unless you have...
C'est drôle ce qu'il a dit. C'est vrai que c'est un putain de feu, Lava Golem. T'as pas envie de donner un feu à l'adversaire.
Another matchup where you want this card. Like, the thing is though, I don't know, what would it be? I guess if it's Voice's Voice, giving a normal summon is so much, it has to be better card than Voice's Voice. The thing is, like, Super Poly and such isn't always good.
Daruma, bah Daruma, si on est honnête, dans le deck qui joue Daruma, c'est une carte incroyable, non? Donc en soi, ça serait strong option. Mais s'il le voit d'un point de vue d'un deck feu, pas sûr qu'il le mette là. Mais Daruma dans l'ab, c'est tellement magnifique que tu la mets là, quoi. On va voir ce qu'il en dit. S'il se place du point de vue du feu, il la mettra pas là.
Use the ritual spell in the grave to summon another from deck. Where Lava Golem's not a card effect, you'd be bypassing that downside or that upside that they have, and that would give this card a little more merit. But I don't know. There has to be something better to play than Lava Golem in those spots. I don't know. Actually, I'm gonna put it here.
Ah,
I think,
voilà.
I don't know.
J'ai eu peur. Respecte-nous, Jesse.
Now that I've given it some chance to sit in my mind. It is terrible versus everything else. Don't get me wrong. But maybe versus tier or versus Vanadium, you can stick this in. And versus voiceless. Don't love it though. Don't get me wrong. Next up is the Ruma Cannon. The Ruma Cannon right now, I mean, it's the same as Eclipse, right? Eclipse is not very strong. This is the same. But it's not a board breaker at any capacity at all. And while Eclipse has some ability to use it going second, Ruma really doesn't. If you want a thrust target, it should be a different dimension ground. I guess if you really don't want a different dimension ground yourself, it can be the Ruma. But if you're playing like a Snake Eye deck and you got hand trapped into the point where you can't play, then thrusting for DDG is fine. You're not actually harming yourself at all. So
la met dans bad parce qu'il estime que du coup, aller chercher des DG en lab. Et si Guillaume avait raison sur les Américains, non. Comme dit, genre, l'average américain est probablement moins fort que l'average européen, mais les meilleurs joueurs sont au même niveau que les meilleurs joueurs européens. Et ça, c'est factuel. Et toute personne qui n'a jamais été aux USA qui donne son avis là-dessus, il faut attendre qu'elle revienne des USA ou qu'elle aille aux USA pour donner un vrai avis.
I wouldn't want to play Karma Cannon for that reason. But yeah, no, this is just not powerful enough. Better than Barrier, but... Next up is Deck Lockdown, another broken floodgate that stops stuff from
Deck Lockdown, stop par choice, je
being
pense.
played. And this card is cool because it can stop the summoning from deck as well. So if your opponent has monsters like Snake Eye Ash, fantastic. However, what it doesn't do is, unlike stuff like Summon Limit, which floods your opponent out, those cards can be sent off.
Il parle que pour les Fire. Bah, en soi, s'il se met du point de vue d'un joueur Fire, effectivement, Daruma c'est bad, tu l'avais pas dans ton deck. Mais dans la méta, elle existe dans certains decks.
By your
Dans,
own Snake
dans
Eye
l'app, quoi.
effects to special from deck and then unlock yourself. Deck Lockdown can't do that because if you have a Snake Eye Ash in the field, you can't activate the effect with Deck Lockdown. And then you are locking yourself. So if you get into a grind, it can be a lot more impactful on yourself. And the same reason why Mistaken Arrest isn't very good, this card isn't good either. I guess it's a bit more impactful than Mistaken Arrest, but no, not a huge fan. And the next one is another controversial decision.
Bon, super poli, moi je la mets dans As Some Merit. Vous la mettez où, vous? Est-ce que vous la mettez dans Strong Option? Moi je la mets dans As Some Merit. Je pense qu'elle est pas si bonne que ça. Et je sais que quand Lucas me déteste quand j'ai des trucs comme ça.
And that is Super Polymerization. I think this card is subpar.
Il est encore plus violent que moi, lui.
This card really is overrated, and I can't put my finger on why the OCG loved this card so much. And maybe after 2 weekends of playing a bit more, my opinion will have changed. But every time I've tested
En fait, comme j'ai dit, ton extra c'est tellement une ressource importante que tu peux pas jouer cette carte. Mais j'avoue que moi je l'aurais quand même mis dans Mérite, c'est une carte quand même. Ah lui vraiment il l'a descendu jusqu'au bout, j'aime bien. Je l'aime bien ce mec, toi t'es un bon
this
toi.
card, it feels if I'm playing breakers, this card doesn't do enough. The Mud Dragon, seemingly good on first appearance that you summon off it, will die to Kieran a lot of the time and then become, you know, just another thrown away body. At which point they'll be able to re-trigger all their effects, and it's not that hard for them to deal with. Ambler Whales as well. Like even if they have other stuff, they could just Ambler Whale pop, and again, you don't have the Mud Dragon anymore. It doesn't target. So not a huge honor from that standpoint. And one thing with board breakers as well is you have to deal with their board plus hand traps, right? And that can be rather hard. So Paul, you're discarding a card, you're going a card down. Now if you're playing Witch as well, you're another card down. If you're playing with Witch especially, you're calling Dark to protect from Imperm. If not, then you're calling
Il est
Fire.
encore là Lucas ou pas? Oh Lucas, écoute papa s'il te plaît. Ta carte de merde là. Il est où? S'il est là encore.
But then the Witch is still vulnerable. Don't love that either. And if you're trying to keep up with the Mud Dragon's way to stop fires, then from targeting fires, it almost can't be interacted with as your own body either.
C'est pas la
So
même tier list pour un local. Ah non, là sa tier list c'est pas pour son tournoi à 16, c'est ce qu'il pense de la méta.
you have to do everything else with the Mud Dragon still on the field. And that's really not that easy. What I also don't like about it is using up your extra deck spaces, which are very valuable in fire decks. And then versus Voiceless Voice, again, the ritual spell offsets it greatly. As a going first card, it's like fine, but if you want to play Garura to make it a good going first card, that's another extra deck spot. To beat some end fields, are you playing the Earth Golem Magnister to beat like Appaloosa plus IP? Again, like, it's just more extra deck spots, and you really can't afford
La méta
it
mais
in
à
that
son
main
niveau.
deck.
Mais non, c'est pas parce que t'es Jesse Cotton que tu... Enfin, les tournois dans lesquels il joue, il les approche... Enfin, c'est les mêmes joueurs que t'affrontes toi dans le même tournoi que tu fais lui, c'est les mêmes. Hein. C'est juste que lui, il t'explique que ça, c'est pas bon. Et moi, je pense qu'il a raison. Mais pour moi, la raison principale qui fait que c'est pas bon, c'est pas forcément la carte en moins, même si ça joue, c'est vraiment l'extra deck.
Now, there are some decks where you can't afford it. In that case, this card's merit goes up. I really just think
WCQ, t'as une meilleure option de Droloni, mais en local, t'as l'impression... Mais non, enfin, non. En fait, je vois ce que tu veux dire, et dans ce que tu veux dire, t'as raison, mais tu t'exprimes mal.
oftentimes it's not enough as a board breaker, and it's just a okay back row. And then also the deck building cost.
Comment t'as trouvé le tour à dire? Je me suis fait chier de fou.
Is not worth it in so many decks.
Mais c'est sympa.
I think it's really low end of has some merit, high end is subpar choice. And it will be in a bunch of decks, but I expect to see it be dropping off a lot in terms of playability and how often it's represented as we progress further into the meta. Next up is Sphere mode.
La couille de rat. 4 ou 5? T'as joué au jeu et tu t'es fait chier. Bah, ronde 1, Flunder, deck shifter. Ronde 2, Orcust, Horus. Ronde 3, Labyrinthe avec shifter et DDG. Et ronde 4, Kashtira avec shifter. Donc ouais, j'aurais préféré passer un meilleur moment. Couille de rat, théoriquement, c'est sub par choice ou bad, hein, actuellement.
You can't even do this for voices match. I'm gonna put this. I don't know. Yeah, not by. I'm not gonna get too much time to this. Same as Lava Golem. I'm not giving them the fire, I guess, though. But if you're trying to kill them, trying to kill them through this is also a pain in the ass. I guess like you'd have to go to Atlantis and summon to face down.
Les decks de con. Non, mais j'ai gagné au pire, mais j'ai gagné 3 matchs sur 4. Mais bon, niveau expérience, bon. TTT. Bon, TTT, il la met tout en haut, non? Strong option ou staple TTT? C'est probablement strong option en vrai. Probablement strong option si on est honnête. Mais c'est un des deux. Pour moi, c'est vraiment un des deux. Ça va pas en 3. TTT, c'est. Waouh.
That works. Sure. Next up is Talents. This is a card that at the start of the format I said would be one of the best staples. Or I thought so at least. I don't know if I said it on Twitch or whatever. However, the more I'm playing and I'm struggling because a lot of my hands lose to Imperm or I brick, Talents is one of the biggest contributors, right? With other hand traps, I can try and stay alive and fight back. Thrusts or Talents isn't. And then when I go second, Talents isn't always the card that will win me the game, right? If I'm able to pair it with other stuff and the rest of my hand is okay, then Talents can be very good. Don't get me wrong. But there are many games where your opponent plays properly around it. Talents won't be enough to recover. And at the same time, it's dead enough going first or contributing to bricks enough going first that I'd almost rather have a hand trap. Now, when it resolves, it can be very strong. And it can be what pushes you to...
Wesh, il est en train de la descendre là. Mets-la dans strong option. Dépêche-toi là.
Success when you go first, being able to play through multiple hand traps. It can be what lets you break through fields when you pair it. And if you want a powerful spell that breaks fields, I think this is the strongest one.
Je préfère, ouais.
But I don't think it is not actually the best staple and has enough flaws in it that there are merits.
Ah ouais, je préfère, ouais. Fais le malin, je préfère, ouais.
To not including it in your deck, main or side. Next was Herald of the Abyss. And this card...
Herald of the Abyss, c'est bad actuellement.
Which isn't good, unfortunately. There's way too many different cards in play, and there's not any one overwhelming oppressive card. It's not like you're dealing with an Arise Heart or a Caesar even or a Noir. That stuff's all kind of phased out. We're not dealing with these one card fields anymore. It's very diverse boards. And in that case, this card just does not do it. Next was Vados.
Vados aussi, c'est dans bad actuellement. D'ailleurs, c'est combien les Vados? J'ai toujours pas récupéré mes 3 Vados, les mecs.
Right, so this is a brand new one. Pretty similar to Ogre, right? Where you can pop a field spell to summon it to your opponent's field, but if they link away with it or goes to your grave for any reason, it'll also nuke the field. But if you're nuking island, it'll nuke everything. This card is cooler than Ogre in the sense that it can be used on activation of field spells. If you're playing versus Chairlement or Manadium, you can hit their field spells, and it's pretty good. It's way better in those matchups than Ghost Ogre is. However, Vados versus Fire King Sanctuary is bad. Like, you aren't going to resolve anything. And Ogre has other applications to make up for it, where Vados doesn't. So that's where I think Vados is just a bad choice right now. It's very unique, and I think one day this could be meta, especially in very field spell heavy. Like...
Ouais, ça je suis d'accord avec lui. La carte, elle est designée trop spécialement pour qu'il y ait pas un jour où on la joue. C'est pour ça que j'aimerais bien récupérer mes 3 Vados en quarter, mais je sais pas combien c'est.
Meta, but now we're not there. Just the unique circumstances of Fire King Sanctuary existing. If it didn't, I think we could see this moved up even higher and this to be actual strong option. I feel like though when this card is good, it'll be high up here. It'll be one of those cards that's very volatile in its playability. Next up is Marionette Might. I honestly should have removed this from my tier list.
On s'en bat les couilles.
Yeah, Unchained is not very popular. Labyrinth is not popular. Let's just put it this here. At the end, my bad. And Eradicator. Great. It's another going first card that's supposed to be impactful. However, there are a lot of monsters in people's decks. They can play with just Witch. They can chain one to get a Witch. Snake Eye Ash still beats you. This cannot be your main line of defense. It cannot be it. While it's not the hardest thing in the world to activate, I would not want to dedicate extra spots to doing so. And there are just better traps to do it, so this card is just bad. Even a Labyrinth, I would not be fixating on resolving Eradicator. And there's no deck.
Attention, il y a une des 2 meilleures cartes du format qui arrive bientôt.
Deck in the form that's really that spell heavy, unless you're playing pure Snake Eye or Fire King Snake Eye that is board breaker built. And in those cases, I transition anti-spell. Only Labyrinth can maybe side deck that card for that matchup. Yeah, Runic as well. Runic is not very popular. Next up is Kaiju, and in similar vein to Herald.
On bat les couilles du Kaiju, dépêche-toi.
The Abyss, the single target removal is not going to cut it, and this is also just not in a strong manner. He has to bypass his anti-spell, but it's never going to be doing enough to be meaningful. So.
Ad, c'est main ou side selon toi alors? Ça dépend ce que tu joues, mais tu le joues de manière générale, faut le jouer en main, je pense.
So, adios, scam seal. Next up is enemy controller.
Il va pas au moins en strong option. Je pense que c'est strong option là, la vérité là.
This is a card that I thought would be a little bit better at the start of the format for stealing cards.
Dépêche-toi.
However, it being targeting gives it some weaknesses to stuff like Kieran, as well as being able to have tributing a monster is not great. With such powerful links, sacking off your own monster, unless they were about to target and destroy it, is actually ass. It is a valuable resource to be giving up that could have turned into a Charmer, or into a Celine, or into a Princess, or into a Link 4. So
Je vous annonce qu'à Vegas, il a contrôleur dans son deck, cet enfoiré, hein, je vous le dis. Je vous le dis haut et fort. À Vegas, ce week-end, il jouera ennemi contrôleur. Je vous le dis. Voilà, je vous le dis. Vous en faites ce que vous voulez. Vous en faites ce que vous voulez. Si Jesse Cotton ne joue pas ennemi contrôleur ce week-end... Ah, mais attends, s'il joue Fire King, il y a moyen qu'il ne l'ait pas. S'il joue Snake Eyes pur, il aura contrôleur. J'avoue, il se fout de ma gueule en plus sur le... Il n'est même pas Spooky dans sa tier list. Ouais, mais bizarrement, il en a 3 en side, c'est escroc.
if they target a princess with an effect,
Parce qu'il sait très bien.
chaining Econ to it doesn't feel that good. Sometimes getting the free value when I was about to die is nice, but when they're popping with like Kieran or an Ambler Whale, you don't have that luxury. You can't actually chain Econ there. Or at least you can't with like the knowledge of the... You can't save your monster.
Oh, dans la tier list, il n'y a même pas Spooky alors qu'il la joue dans son side et qu'il y a Dark Hole. Putain.
You'll still get a card popped. Econ on Appaloosa can be very good, or even Econ steal like your opponent's only fire monster turning off Princess can be very good when they don't have Kieran. Econ has a lot of power in those scenarios. And the other problem with it though is Anti-Spell, right? And it's going to be a recurring thing, right? We're expecting Anti-Spell in the meta. We want to make sure our cards are powerful enough. Now, one of the upsides to enemy controller is when you go first, it is impactful. It's not brilliant, but enemy controller as a disruption is very good when you get to play a bunch. And when you get hand trapped a bunch, even Econ tribute like Snake Eye Ash is fine. Obviously, it requires you to be sacking off a body, which I don't love, but it's still okay. Next up is Forbidden Droplets.
Tu vas la mettre dans Mérite,
This is one
celle-là,
that I
je
know a lot
pense.
of people liking as well. It's a very high
Mérite,
end
je
of
pense que c'est bien
or
pour ça.
maybe even just a strong option. It's one that I've not tested enough, but I know a lot of people enjoy or have been liking, partially because it isn't as weak to Anti-Spell. And then unlike Chalice, they can't chain Flamebird to it to bring out the IP, so you can actually hit Flamebird in an effective manner in that way. And then you can hit multi-targets at once, right? So if they have Flamebird Appaloosa, you can hit both of them together. Or you can hit the Arvada and all that such. You can also combo together with normal spells or quick plays, so if you get Wanted, you can send off that. They have 3 cards like Bonfire, Chain Wanted, Chain Droplet, send to monsters. They can chain anything and really shut them off. And there is an obvious reason why it's better than Chalice in those regards. Going first is a bit more costly, and if you get disrupted, it is that to accomplish the same thing as Imprimer Chalice, you have to throw another card. In those Grimes, you can perform rather poorly. I don't love that. And then my general thing is I don't love the board breakers as much because playing through the board plus the hand traps, if to play hand traps, can be difficult. So I think this is one of the stronger board breakers, and it does bypass some of the problems a lot of the other board breakers have. So you can almost put it here, and if I wasn't so strongly in favor of playing hand traps, I'd probably go up here. But yeah, I think as far as board breakers goes, Droplet is one of the best ones. Then we got Evenly Matched. This is a card I on infinitely, and that
Vu qu'il parle d'un point de vue du feu, il va la mettre dans sub par choice. Moi, je la mettrais dans 3.
will
Mérite.
not change anytime soon. Yes, this is the type of format you think Evenly is good because there's no way to negate it. There's a bunch of cards in the field. You get value out of it. However, there's still plenty of ways to play after Evenly. There's still going to be more disruptions after the fact. They can keep stuff like Appaloosa. The Princess will still be there. If they have Kieran in hand, it's not that hard for them to navigate around it. They have other hand traps. And the thing is, you give up your battle phase. That's a very powerful resource to either force through disruption or to win the game. Because if you can't kill them sometimes, they'll just have too much going for you to win in the long run.
Pas fan de cet argument, mais en fait, il peut pas aimer Evenly à partir du moment où lui, il veut tuer T2.
Even though Evenly can get rid of some actual resources for the long game, it's often not enough. Yeah, I don't love the card. As far as other matchups go, it's still bad as Labyrinth. It's not good as Voiceless. I'll just negate it. You can pair multiple things together, but it's still not great. Yeah, Evenly, not a card I would put my faith in. Nothing's changed there. We have the Super Ancient Organism.
Pas le truc contre Branded, ça? Cimetière des machins millénaires, ça?
You can stop Flamebird, you can stop Garunix, you can stop Skull Guardian, you can stop
Je vais la mettre
Lovely,
dans bas,
but
donc.
it loses to SP and everything else, and it's just bad.
Ah,
Yeah.
voilà.
I think this card will just
Ça, c'est un bestial. Les bestioles, s'ils vont pas dans As Submerit, je pète mon crâne.
be terrible because of SP for a while now, unless the meta drastically changes.
Dans les bestiales, ils doivent au moins être dans mérite, c'est bien.
Expecting that much. If we have a lot of branded and you really have an issue with the deck, then you can throw this in as like your ace in the hole, but maybe it's a subpar choice because of that reason, or it has some very little merit, but I think it's horrific in like every other scenario. Next up, the bestials. Let's move these together because they go hand in hand. They have some merit. They are effectively useless versus Fire King. Let me be clear. However, there are other decks in the meta, albeit when you go to tournament, not as many non-fire decks. Versus tier, these are still strong because they put up bodies that also then do other stuff as well, while clearing out the tier names. A lot more effective than DD Crow. They can also be good versus Labyrinth to shut off some of their follow-up, their resource game. You can hit the lovely Labyrinth, which will greatly turn off their ability to disrupt you, and that's pretty good. And then versus Voiceless as well, it's okay, because when they go revive low, if you Crow it, or Bestial it in this case, it can stop them. Although the same as we talked about with Crow and Bell, right? If they have the trap already, they can still get to it, and it's not that big of a deal. Just keep in mind, like, if you have a bunch of dead cards to side out because your deck is built for fire, you'd probably put these in. And unlike the Crow and Bell, at least these are bodies in the field you could link with, which in most decks is very helpful. One cool thing about Magnamut is you can search Flamebridge off it, which may not be apparently the best thing in the world, but when you have the body up,
Donc j'y avais jamais pensé ça, mais Magnamut au Flamberge en vrai si tu veux, c'est vrai ça.
and you have easy access to something like
Pas un joueur de dragon comme c'est mon vieux Guillaume.
then you have a clear outlet to utilize the Flamebridge, then adding it is actually pretty good. Next up is XYZ Encore. Let's think about why these cards being played before. It was for Dweller, for Noir, and with those things not in the metagame anymore really, then this card can just go in the bad unplayable section. Now it's almost a bit surprising that Dweller hasn't seen a huge resurgence in play.
Moon se part. On s'en fout. Je vais avancer un peu les gars. Je vais avancer un peu. On va aller à Trust je pense. Là j'avoue que les cartes qui suivent on un peu les couilles. On peut voir qu'il a mis Ibleed en bad, qu'il a mis Gamma ici. Oh non, Gamma il l'a mis là quand même. Strong option. C'est intéressant. Quoi ça du coup? Il y avait jusqu'à Trust là.
This card is pretty close to unplayable because we're in a fire meta, right? Like if there were enough fire links or enough non-fire links, maybe this card would be playable, but like even if you keep them on SP, Phoenix can clear it relatively easily. Garunix deals with it so easily as well with Kieran's help, obviously. Even if they're cut off of SP and Zelantis and that stuff, like Princess with the firing cards is still just brutal. Like I'm not expecting to win with that. Yeah, Gozen is not worth a spot in my deck. Next up is Thrust. I think this card has some merit, and though I liked it a lot.
Ouais, ça, Trust pour moi elle va là. Il n'y a pas énormément de decks. Enfin, dans Feu, je vois pas comment tu peux la placer. Mais par contre, dans Branded, c'est quand même pas mal. Hein.
At the start of the format, I actually don't think it's a brilliant option right now, and it falls in the same line with Change of Heart and all these other breakers I was talking about. I just am scared of Anti-Spell and Droll, and I think your non-engine shouldn't fall too prey to these, because your engine is already a little bit weak to them, right? And when people are playing into them, that's what makes these cards really killer. While you can build a deck around a Thrust strategy and go second with breakers, and it very easily can work through Fire King, it's just such a risk when these are in the meta. And that's why it has some merit, but it's really risky. Next up is Retaliating Sea. This one was a weird one. I pondered for a bit when we first announced the Snake Eye cards, because when they go original Sinful Snake Eye or whatever to summon from deck, you can Retaliating Sea. And then cards get banished, right? But then also they can't send for Snake Eye Ash or whatever. And there's a chance you completely catch your opponent off guard, and that's sick. However, if you Retaliating Sea and they have Flamebridge in the field, if they go summon Flamebridge first and then when Sinful Spoil, and they saw it and use Flamebridge effect, they can Flamebridge or Retaliating Sea in the Spell Trap Card zone, and you effectively accomplish nothing besides banishing the Sinful Spoils. And that is not worth it. That huge risk makes it not good. There's obviously the Talons Thrust thing, where they can just steal it, link it off, and it's no longer a threat. The card has some interesting properties. It's not like the worst thing, but its merits are not bring enough for me to put it here. When I say has some merit, I want it to be more than literally. I want it to be more than a little bit. I want it to have actual bit of merit to it. So yeah, interesting choice.
Imperme, ça va tout en haut, on est d'accord. Imperme, il n'y a aucun monde où c'est pas tout en haut. Imperme, c'est une carte que tu veux dans ton deck. Genre vraiment, il n'y a aucun monde où tu veux pas Imperme dans ton deck, je pense. Je pense que vous êtes tous d'accord.
Ultimately, there are too many play arounds that it's not worth it. Maybe if we get into a point in the meta where there's very common patterns of play and Retaliating Sea beats that pattern of play, it could be a meta call for a specific tournament. But with the broad meta, unclear combo lines, and all such, this is not going to have a spot in the immediate future. Next up is Infinite Permanence, and I think this is probably one of the best 2 cards in the game right now as far as hand traps go. There's a good chance this can brick your opponents when they're playing Fire Kings, which is just bonkers to me. I hate playing Fire King for that reason. Fire King can be very cool many times, but when you get impermanent pass, it sucks. And it happens a lot on Divalstar and sometimes Snake Eye Ash. That's why Kieran can help a lot as well. Talents doesn't help play through it. And Callby can't beat it either, so this card is just nasty. And then this one's also good to pair, right? You can stop them just like that, or if you pair it with Nib, it's broken, or if you pair it even with another Veiler, it can be pretty good, or with Ash, it's solid. Yeah, very good. I like this card a lot. Next up is Kurikara. This card has some merit.
Ah, il va la mettre en 3, ça, c'est sûr.
And it's largely because it's searchable. I think this card is typically pretty bad. However, being able to search it off Snake Eye Ash, that was given it a place in the meta. Obviously, you can just side deck it in for something like Pearly. But the main merit it has is when they use Appaloosa negate once, and after they use SP to
Qui va être aussi tranché que moi sur Nibiru? Pour moi, Nibiru, c'est tout en haut, genre.
banish, Kurikara can hit those 2 type of interrupts.
Vous l'avez entendu tout à l'heure quand on a fait quand je vous ai présenté un peu ce que je jouais et mes idées. Pour moi, Nibiru, c'est vraiment tout en haut, genre.
Huge body that revives from your opponent's grave. So if they have IP, or if they have even SP, or I don't know, just anything meaningful, you can start reviving their monsters to act disruption and bodies for a grind game. Very strong. But it's not every game state's like that. It's not a reliable thing that you always get to that.
Parce que là, les 3 autres, il va les mettre en bad.
It's not a card I just want to hard draw for that reason.
Normalement.
The as searchable utility, it can be very good. And the obvious downside is, if you want to main deck this type of thing, is it's terrible to draw going first. Even if you full combo, if your opponent has a lot of strong power spells like talents or high engine count, you may have wanted a hand trap to stay alive, and instead you're stuck with like a Kurikara. Especially if your hand has 2 bonfires and a Kurikara, so you have 2 bricks in your hand, and you may really wish you cut down those cards that were completely useless going first. Next up is Forbidden Lance. This is one of the few cards that can play through Imperm, but it can't play around like anything else. In theory, like there are maybe some like board breakers this would be decent against, but going into a field with this card is just straight up unplayable. So this card is just bad. It's not gonna be in anyone's deck, and for a good reason. Okay, Ultimate Slayer, another terrible card. I think is just highly overrated. Could be cool to spin back their Appaloosa, and then you get to send another card on the field to grave. If their field is Appaloosa plus Arvada, you could force out a lot like that. And obviously they would just Arvada the Evil Twin Engrave to not lose their fire count on field, unless they Kieran on hand, in which case. And then it also comes at the cost of brick in your deck and the card in your extra deck, which, as we talked.
Ce que j'aime bien, c'est que là où moi je serais une ordure et les cartes que je pense être nulles, je les mettrais dans bad et je discuterais même pas. Lui, il force le truc quand même. En vrai, respect pour ça. Lui, il explique vraiment pourquoi c'est nul. Moi, j'avoue que j'aurais pas le temps.
But it's just not great as a board breaker, right? I think there are better options. It's okay at clearing through fields. It's just there's better. And then it has the same weaknesses of if you're trying to thrust for this, it's just draw's an issue. Like turning on their draw sucks.
La on trap qui donne des PV, Spooky, donc tu penses qu'elle est bien, mais je pense qu'elle est mandatory dans tous les decks pour un gros tournoi.
And ça, obviously just makes this card in a blank, which is what we want to avoid. So yeah, this card is a very subpar choice. Next up is Skill Drain. Okay, where does Skill Drain fit? I haven't thought about this. If I'm playing Fire King, am I scared of my opponent throwing Skill Drain on me? Yeah. It can be hard to resolve a Kieran to pop it. Outside of that, it's not that easy. You can put up big floaters pretty effectively, and Princess is still acts disruption. So Skill Drain will never carry the game, but it can keep people at bay or stop them from being truly combo-centric. Now, obviously, Snake Eye Ash can still trigger some Flame Burge, and Link Rebo can actually force through your level 1 effects. So you can still do quite a bit under Skill Drain. It's just the heavy pushes you can't really do. Now, some people are playing Access Code Talker, which means they can Access Code Talker banish itself to kill Skill Drain. But otherwise, it's not the easiest thing in the world to clear. So if you have Skill Drain, it's not going to be enough to solo, but it will, if you're applying pressure, do something. That being said, there's probably better stuff to play, and it's not like the most amazing card versus Fire King. It's like playable, but I wouldn't recommend it very highly.
Bon, Nibiru, il va où? Moi, je le mets tout en haut. À votre avis, il le met dans Strong Option ou dans tout en haut? Moi, je le mets tout en haut.
Next up is Nibiru. I'd probably put this as first or second best card. This card, while it's unlikely to completely nullify the Snake Eye Ash combo by itself, it is insane when it gets paired with anything else. It's nuts when it goes first. And if your hand is playable, if you Nibiru them, it makes their field weak enough that oftentimes this engine is pretty good. And it's nice as well with the body in play. If you hit the body up, you can do a lot with it, right? That's you going to Charmers, which going second is really important. It's big enough where it can attack over monsters as well if I have an SP.
Je vous jure que je suis pas trop à la rue, en tout cas. Si genre vraiment, Bon, à part pour ennemi contrôleur où on n'est pas d'accord, mais genre vraiment, je suis corda là.
And you're trying to go to a grind game, although that play obviously requires using the battle phase, which I'd recommend avoiding. And then the other cool application is, I talked about it before, you can use this going second. It's very weird because the Flamebird can bring back IP, and then IP can link away for links number 2, and then they summon twice off Flamebird, that's 4 summons. Now a Princess can be 5, a Karibo could be 5,
Yep.
a Kieran could be 5.
Exactement. C'est incroyable. C'est un des trucs qui fait que Nibiru est trop broken actuellement, c'est que les meilleurs decks, ils invoquent 5 pendant ton tour à toi. Donc ça peut être une option pour reset un field. C'est n'importe quoi ça. Genre en fait, quand littéralement Flamberge invoque IP, IP fait un lien, whatever le lien, en utilisant Flamberge, c'est 4 summon.
A Kieran or Garunix or any of those things. So there's plenty of ways for them to summon 5 times in a turn, right? They actually summon quite a bit. And when we see those games happening, Nibiru, while not an incredible card, can clear the field if there are any interrupts. Sometimes versus P can be good, but primarily what it's good against is just summoning a body. And it's cool when it gets cross out. It's not completely dead in your turn, which is nice when your other hand trap would just be thrown into the grave immediately with no sort of upside. Next up, we've got Gravekeeper and
je sais pas si la Gravekeeper, il va la mettre dans mérite ou dans subpar. Hein. En vrai, j'ai un peu du mal. J'avoue que j'ai du mal à me dire qu'elle est intéressante parce qu'elle se fait que en début de main phase 1, donc je la mettrai en subpar. Mais elle paraissait quand même très intéressante avant l'arrivée du format.
So, at first, when I looked at this format, I thought this card would be great. It would be like in tier element format, almost about a year ago this time, where the cash decks would main 3 of this with 3 shifter and just be heavy anti-graveyard centric. But I think Fire can deal with this like, enough because you're putting bodies in fields enough of the time without using the graveyard effects that you can do stuff. You can make SP, you can make IP, make Apo. You can put enough pressure that Inscription is not enough to solo you, and when you have a board and then Inscription you again, it's not the end of the world. It does help to play through fields. It's not like an unplayable card by any means, but it's not going to solo in the same way that it felt like it soloed an entire 2 turns against Sheer Elements. And it is worse than I thought. It also has weaknesses to Anti-Spell, but when it resolves, it is pretty good and does work towards breaking the field. And obviously, this is deck dependent on what you're playing, but it is a card that has some merits to it. Yeah. And if you're playing the right deck for it, there's a decent chance you're playing.
Jugement. Alors, jugement, le problème, c'est que ça va pas être objectif parce que moi, en vrai, je la mettrais là, moi. Moi, je la mettrais dans Strong Option parce que je pense que Jugement et Solemn Strike, c'est pas mauvais actuellement. Mais c'est avec une semaine de plus, donc peut-être que lui, il va pas aimer. Mais en gros, je pense... Bah, en fait, si, je pense qu'il va aimer parce qu'il a joué Solemn Strike. Il y a moyen que Jugement soit mieux que Parfum sur le long terme, mais je suis pas sûr. J'ai hâte de voir ce qu'il va dire sur Jugement. Moi, je la mettrais dans Strong Option. Moi.
To the point where if you can play it, you should always play it. Next up is Judgment. I'm going to also include Strike in here. I'm going to quickly talk about some of them as well, because these are the last 2 cards here that you want to side in for going first, really. In most of these decks, you may have 1 slot designated towards these type of cards. Strike and Judgment are better in the case of hand trap wars because you get direct value out of them. You are trading, you're often trying to see who go plus the most before trying to kill. Strike and Judgment are good at doing that. They're also a bit more flexible. And I think if we're seeing these very high hand trap counts, this is the best option. Ooh. However, if there are going to be some board breakers, some element has merit to it too because it's the middle of the road. You can still turn this off with your own Snake Eye.
Oh. D'accord avec moi.
Ash, but if they have a Snake Eye Ash and you have some element, they aren't going to be able to play through it. They're going to have to pass in the Poplar immediately, unlike where Anti-Spell would have beat them. However, if they're very board breaker centric, or if they're playing like Despia, Anti-Spell probably would have been better. Maybe versus Despia, someone that's probably fine anyways because they don't deal with back row very well. But say like the board breaker.
Moi, je trouve qu'il a même pas mis Strike dans sa tier list alors qu'il la joue. Bon, il a dit qu'il le comptait avec. Mais c'est vrai que... C'est vrai qu'il n'y a pas Solemn Strike et il n'y a pas Spooky alors qu'il joue les deux quand même. Jesse James.
Fire King Snake Eye deck or just pure Snake Eye deck that plays board breakers with like Engage and stuff in the deck. The summon limit can be pushed through. Stuff like Mind Control, Snatch Deal, if they have those, they can make a SP relatively quickly without summoning twice. And in those cases, this card will again falter, right? It's not terrible by any means. All of these are strong options, and we should see all of these seeing play in side decks. This includes Strike. But yeah, no. Another powerful card is Soul Release that Anti-Spell stops, Judgment stops, but the other 2 don't. That being said, Soul Release I actually didn't include on this list. I really should include Soul Release. I forgot about it. I forgot about it. I'm gonna tell you guys. So those who skipped to see the end of the tier list won't see it. Unfortunately, I'll just tell you where I put Soul Release, and I'd put it in the subpart choice.
Oh. Eh, vous voyez que ça valait le coup de mater la vidéo. Il parle de soul release quand même. Comme ça, les connards comme Lucas qui vont à la fin pour voir, ils en prennent plein la gueule. Et donc, il estime que ce soul release, c'est sub par choice.
So I know I just said it was pretty strong, but I was almost like a gut reflex to say it's pretty strong, because in actuality, after having played with and against it a lot, I think it doesn't do enough a lot of the time. There'll still be the field on board, often an Appaloosa, or they'll have the Arvada or the IP, and then they'll probably be going for side deck cards in there plus the hand traps, right? So while that can be enough, it's not always enough. And then you obviously have huge weaknesses to anti-spell, which I really dislike. I really want my side deck card to be functional versus that as well. And then the fact that it's not enough by itself. Like if I'm putting a card with these risks in it, I want to close out the game on the spot. And I don't think it is enough. Now, there are plenty of ways to play on Soul Release, where I think they play worse into everything else, which is why I don't focus on them too much. If Soul Release has become heavily popular in the meta, then you play on Soul Release by putting stuff like Garunix or Arvada and spell trap cards with Flamebirch and playing like that, and it makes something like Soul Release a lot less effective. Or if you Sunlight Wolf, add back the Garunix. Now when you pop something, the Garunix comes out of hand instead. Now there's no guarantee that this is entirely worth it, but these are options should we expect a lot of Soul Release being played. And I don't like the Soul Release has that play around it ability. I don't like that it loses the anti-spell. I don't like that it's not always enough by itself. And it's just, yeah, Soul Release here subpar choice. It's probably the top end of subpar choice. I think it's super poly, it's a trap. They seem very strong, but they're ultimately just not worth it. And for cards to do similar things, there's just typically better options. Yeah. Next up is Lightning Storm, and there's nothing you want a Lightning Storm really as far as monsters go. I'm going to say it goes exactly where Duster is because it functions the exact same premise. If you want more copies of Duster, you play 2 Lightning Storms or vice versa. But these really function as exact same cards and you're never really...
Bon, du coup, il reste quoi en intéressant? Shifter, strong option. Veiler, strong option. Dino Luther, il va probablement le mettre en mérite. Et les 2 pièges là, il les mettra quoi en mérite? On va avancer en vrai. Oh, Veiler Shifter, best Apple. J'avoue que Shifter, en vrai, j'ai... Dino Luther mérite. Oh, il a mis Rivalry là. Il a pas eu PTT. Si, elle est là. Shifter, best Apple. Ouais, bah la vérité, c'est que si tu joues Shifter, c'est la meilleure carte de ton deck. Donc oui, en fait. Autant Veiler, je l'aurais mis à côté de Droll. Autant Shifter, là, je comprends. Bon, bah c'était un peu long. Désolé pour ceux qui avaient un peu la flemme de se faire les 1 heure. Mais au vu des explications qu'il donnait, bah je pense que c'est très intéressant. En vrai, j'ai trouvé que c'était ultra intéressant comme vidéo. Je sais pas ce que vous avez pensé. D'ailleurs, je vais mettre mon petit pouce bleu.